Hello. Welcome back to the Metal Hunter. My name is Luke, and I'm going to be tackling another year. This time I'm going to be doing 1989. Now, 1989 was a huge year for metal. So many great bands releasing albums and so many great bands getting their start. Also, there was a bit of metal in the mainstream. So before we do get into the video, I will just do a bit of housekeeping. I am trying to get to 10,000 subscribers before this lockdown is over. So if you can help me out with that, that would be wonderful. Also, if you could follow me on social media, I am on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at The Metal Hunter. That would be wonderful. That's where I post a lot of my collections and things like that. So what was happening in 1989 in the mainstream? Well, Tim Burton's Batman was crushing it at the box office. George W. Bush Sr. had become president of the USA, which is kind of weird to think that there was two George Bushes and which one was worse or which one was I mean, I was 2 years old, so I didn't give a shit. In music, Motley Crue hits #1 with Dr. Feelgood, which is a huge thing to happen. Obviously, in the tail end of the 80s, a lot of hair metal and glam metal was actually cracking into the mainstream, which I feel like actually made a bit of a pathway for bands who were doing like the grunge thing in the early 90s to really kind of capture the audience's attention because it showcased a lot of more aggressive music that could be palatable to the mainstream. We also had people like Paula Abdul and New Kids on the Block who were dominating the charts, and the amazing band The Cure released probably their best album, Disintegration. On TV, you had people like Seinfeld and shows like Saved by the Bell premiering. In bad news, you had the communist government brutally cracking down on protesters demonstrating in Tiananmen Square. I'm sure that we've all seen the footage of that, which is pretty shocking. But in great news, the first Nintendo Game Boy launched in November of 1989, which I'm a huge fan of Nintendo, and I had a Game Boy when I was a kid, so that's wonderful news. All right, I know that you guys don't give a shit about all that stuff, and you really want me to talk about the metal, so here we go. So we've got some bands that formed. There's a bunch of bands that got started in 1989. You know, there was so many bands in the 70s and 80s that were creating metal. So a lot of teenagers were coming up and listening to more aggressive stuff like punk, hardcore, and metal. So they were trying to start their own things. You know, the government that they, or the American government at least, was a lot of people weren't happy with. So people were pissed off and they were wanting to make aggressive music. Okay, so let's run through this. There's so many bands that got started. So we've got Abhorrence, Belsagoth, Benediction, Brugeria. Bruce Dickinson's solo career starts, though he remains in Iron Maiden until 1993. Cathedral, Dark Tranquillity, who started out as Septic Broiler, and I think it was about 92 that they changed their name to Dark Tranquillity. And for a fun fact for you, Anders, who is the vocalist for In Flames, was actually the original vocalist in Dark Tranquillity. And basically, they just swapped vocalists, which I think is amazing because they work best in each band. Bands like Disembowelment, Dissection, and Dungeon got started. Disembowelment and Dungeon are both Australian. Dungeon went on to turn their name to Lord, a fantastic power metal band that you definitely should check out. Doro begins her solo career after Warlock breaks up. Bands like Edge of Sanity, Fear Factory, Gamma Ray, and the Gathering get started. Gorefest, Gorguts, Helmet, Incantation, Infectious Grooves, which is a side project of members of Suicidal Tendencies, can't believe I almost forgot that. Isengard, which is a side project of members of Darkthrone. Bands like Life of Agony, Living Sacrifice. Marilyn Manson gets his start. Mortician, not Mortification. Necrophobic, November's Doom, Primus, Primordial, Sentenced, Psy, Stone Temple Pilots, which is surprising to me. For some reason, I thought that they started much later because they are a part of that second wave of grunge. Bands like Unleashed, Vomitory, and Vital Remains. Bands that broke up. So Cacophony, I've mentioned Cacophony before. It was Marty Freeman and Jason Becker. And then Dokken broke up, but they also then got back together in 1993. So that was a short-lived thing. Schmier from Destruction leaves the band. He later then returns to the band, obviously, because they've been putting out some pretty consistent material ever since. So a huge year for bands getting started. So many just like fucking watershed bands. Fear Factory for one, man. They are up there with some of the best bands of all time. Cathedral, man. Lee Dorian not only fronted Napalm Death originally, he fronted Cathedral, which is an amazing doom band. And then he went on to create Rise Above Records. Man, my memory is just so shot. Bruce Dickinson, solo career starts. He stays in the band until 1993. And then Blaze Bayley takes over, and Blaze Bayley gets mentioned a little bit later, and I'll talk a bit more about him. British bastard death metal Benediction gets started. Mexican death metal Brujeria gets started. Man, so many fucking amazing bands got started in 1989. Bands that get talked about now still, and bands that are still around, still putting out albums. So 1989 was a fantastic year for bands starting. All right, now let's get into the albums released. Now, much like my 1988 album list, I went through and grabbed a lot of stuff from, easy lists to find, like Wikipedia and Metal Archives and things like that. But I also tried to do a bit more of a deep dive and find some bands and albums that, I didn't necessarily know about, and you guys might not know about. You might know about it. You might be way more metal than I am, so I'd love to hear about it. All right, so firstly we had Acid Rain, The Fear. I've spoken about Acid Rain before. This is I think it's like their second or third full length, really, really good UK thrash metal. Then we've got Accept, Eat the Heat. Accept a German heavy metal band, really, really good quality, straightforward heavy metal. In mainstream, we had Aerosmith release Pump. Aerosmith are a band that I grew up listening to. I think that they're a very enjoyable band. They're more of a ballad band now. They kind of just went, we're a ballad band and this is just what we're gonna release. But before that, they were really putting out some rockin' tunes. So they're definitely worthy of a mention here. And I think that they were a bit of a gateway band for a lot of people. When they were, say 8 or 9, they would hear a band like Aerosmith and go, this is fucking awesome. It's electric. I really want to hear more of this kind of stuff. Next up, we've got Alice Cooper, Trash. This is one of my favorite albums from Alice Cooper, or could be my favorite album by Alice Cooper. It's probably the album that really pushed him through to the mainstream. A lot more people knew about him with this album, especially with the track Poison. Next up, we've got Annihilator with Alice in Hell. Now, this is an album that I've spoken about, one of the most underrated thrash bands of all time. Just absolutely fantastic. This one came out on Road Racer. Was it Road Racer? Yeah, Road Racer 1989. And this is a first press. We've got the liner notes in there, and the lyrics and everything like that. Annihilator are still kicking around. I think that they've got a new album out or just about to come out. And Jeff Waters, I think, is singing on this album. He didn't sing on this album. We had Randy Rampage, who unfortunately passed away last year, just there. He sang on this album, and man, what a voice. What an album. Next up, we've got Atheist with Piece of Time. Now, Atheist are a band that I hold in the same regard as Cynic, as one of those bands that really spearheaded the progressive death metal of the late 80s and early 90s, and especially with their incorporation of a lot of different instruments. I think that they really paved the way for bands like Rivers of Nile and Veil of Maya and The Faceless and bands like that. Next up, we've got... Now, I've got 3 copies of this album. I don't have one on vinyl, which is a bit of a shame, but it is Autopsy with Severed Survival. I'm trying to get it so it's not in the glare. I've got that one. I've got the re-release digipack with the new album cover. And then I've got the Peaceville re-release with the little card on the side there. Anyway, the drummer from Death, after they put out Scream Bloody Gore, he went on to create Autopsy. He sings and plays drums in it, and they're still releasing albums to this day, and they're a fucking awesome death metal band. Next, we've got Bad Brains with Quickness. Now, Bad Brains are a hardcore punk band. Absolutely fucking essential when it comes to crossover style bands. I think a lot of people forget that hardcore was actually a really, really huge component when it comes to metal, and so was punk. So Bad Brains definitely have to be mentioned on here. Next up, we've got Black Sabbath with Headless Cross. Now, this was the second album with Tony Martin. I'm not really a big fan of this era of Black Sabbath. I'm more so just about Ozzy and Dio singing in Black Sabbath. But it's. I think that there's something for everyone when it comes to Black Sabbath. Each era has something new and different. The first 6 are pretty much untouchable to me. Next up, we've got Blind Guardian with Follow the Blind. Now, I spoke about Blind Guardian being one of the more out there power metal bands, as in they really, really push themselves to be as grandiose as possible, and Follow the Blind is no exception. Next, we've got Blood, Impulse to Destroy. This is a band that I only just heard for the first time while basically investigating and searching for albums from this year, and they blew me away. So if you haven't heard these guys and you're into death metal, you should definitely check them out. Next up, we've got Bolt Thrower, Realm of Chaos. Now, and then it's called Slaves to Darkness. Bolt Thrower, British death metal, absolutely fucking awesome band. I've mentioned that I got to see them in like 2010, which is now 10 years ago. Man, I'm feeling fucking old. Next up, we've got Candlemass, Tales of Creation. Now, this one is a re-release from Peaceville that came out in 2001. It's got like a bonus disc in it and shit like that, which has some demos from the time, which and I absolutely love the artwork. Candlemass have always done really well with their artwork and made it kind of like intriguing to people who are into like fantastical kind of things, I guess. Next up, on the last list, I didn't include a lot of demos, but I think that this one is a very, very important one. Cannibal Corpse released their self-titled demo. Cannibal Corpse are one of my favorite bands. I talk about them quite a bit. I think that without them, death metal couldn't have gotten to where it has gotten to. They weren't exactly a progenitor of the style, but they definitely took it and made it their own. Next up, we've got Carcass, Symphonies of Sickness. I've spoken about Carcass before, about them being a band that I either love or hate. This is an album that I absolutely love. It's one of the few albums from them that I love start to finish. So it's a very odd thing with Carcass. They're one of the only bands that I either love an album or I hate an album, but this is definitely one that I love. Next up, we've got Coroner, No More Color. Now, I mentioned in 1987, or in the 1987 video, I wouldn't have mentioned anything in 1987 because that was the year that I was born, so I would have been like fucking goo goo gaga. Coroner released albums in 1987, 1988, and 1989, and then I think there was another one in 1991, but I might be wrong about that. But in 1989, they released No More Color, that came out on Noise Records as well. They're teeing up to put out a new record very shortly, so keep your eyes and ears out for that one. Next up, we've got Cro-Mags with Best Wishes. As I said, there's a lot of hardcore bands that have released really incredible albums in the late 80s, so I would be a dickhead if I didn't mention bands like Cro-Mags. Next up, we've got The Cult with Sonic Temple. This is another band that I feel like I need to mention in the same vein as Aerosmith and Kiss, where they're a band that was creating more of a mainstream, straightforward rock style, but I think that it created something for people to grab onto and then bunny hop to like something heavier, or even just stay into that style of stuff, because honestly, that record is fucking awesome. It might even be their best record. Next up, we've got Dark Angel with Leave Scars. Dark Angel are an underrated thrash metal band. I think a lot of people don't mention them when they're talking about bands that are influential. I think that Dark Angel are a band that really kind of spearheaded something that was kind of pushing towards death metal and towards that faster style. So yeah, they're fucking awesome. And Gene Hoglan, man, what a drummer. Next up, we've got Devastation with Signs of Life. This is another band that I'd seen the logo around, I'd heard of the band, but I'd never really made any conscious effort to check them out. And I did check them out yesterday, and fuck me, they're heavy. They're so good. If you like that early style of death metal, you definitely should check this out. Next up, we've got Doro with her first solo record. It's called Force Majeure. Now, this is a record that I thought was lacking a little bit. As I've said before, I'm a huge Warlock fan. I'm a huge Doro fan. There are tracks on it that I think are fucking quintessential Doro, but overall, I think it was a little bit too much filler. And I think that she kind of maybe rushed the record. Next up, we've got Dream Theater with When Dreams and Day Unite. When Dream and Day Unite. That's how I've got it written down. So it could be When Dreams and Day Unite, or When Dream and Days Unite. Who knows? Grammatically incorrect. Dream Theater are a band much like Carcass, where there are albums that I absolutely love, and then there are albums that I absolutely hate. Overall, I think that they're a really good band. I think that James Labrie has a very specific, sometimes annoying voice that I can't listen to all the time. I think the album's called Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory. That record is my favorite, I think. Maybe that tied with Train of Thought. All the other records have great tracks on it, but overall, it's not really for me. I know that there's a lot of people out there that might grab out the pitchforks and torches and come and try and kill me for that, but hey, it's just my opinion. Next up, we've got DRI with Thrash Zone. Now, this one came out on Metal Blade Records. This is a very well looked after 1995 press of this album. I bought this off a seller a couple of years ago, and it was just in such good condition. I'd really love to get a 1989 version of it, and I'd like to get one on vinyl, but prices, they are fucking steep. Next up, okay, so this is a band that I found. They're called DVC, which stands for Darth Vader's Church. The album is called Descendant Upheaval, and these guys are basically a Star Wars death metal band. There is a metal band that worships Star Wars at the moment. I can't remember what they're called, Galactic Empire or something like that. That's not really for me. Like, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I've actually got a Wookiee tattooed on my leg, so it's one of my favorite franchises of all time. So to find that in 1989 there was a death metal band just writing stuff about Star Wars is absolutely fucking amazing to me. Okay, next up we've got Evil Dead with Annihilation of Civilization. Absolutely fucking bonkers artwork on this one. It's another band that I'd only just checked out for the first time, but I've definitely become a fan thanks to getting into these lists. Next up, we've got Exodus with Fabulous Disaster. Exodus I've spoken about quite a bit. I actually don't own a copy of this album, but I absolutely love it. I think that Exodus, if there was a big six, Exodus would probably be a part of that. And I have to agree. One of my friends actually commented on the video recently about Megadeth. I was talking about. What was I talking about? I was talking about So Far So Good So What, which came out in 1988, and I was saying that I didn't really think that it was a great record. I really don't think that Megadeth should be in the big four. I think that Testament probably should be, and then shortly followed by Exodus, and Megadeth could probably be in the big 10 or whatever. Next up, we've got Faith No More with The Real Thing. Now, this is the first record with Mike Patton on vocals. So this is where I feel like Faith No More really started. Next up, we've got Fate's Warning with Perfect Symmetry. Fate's Warning actually released an album in 1988. So the year before, they were one of those bands that were putting out records as quickly as possible. Next up, we've got Godflesh with Street Cleaner. Now, Godflesh got started in 1988, and they released Street Cleaner in 1989. This would be one of their most talked about records. Absolutely influential to a lot of musicians, especially when it comes to doom and drone. Next up, we've got Gorilla Biscuits, Start Today. Now, Gorilla Biscuits are more of a punk band, but as I said before, with the crossover styles, I'd really think that Gorilla Biscuits are worth a mention, because a lot of bands who were more into a punk kind of thing, it really pushed them towards like a thrashy kind of hardcore style. Next up, we've got Helstar with Nosferatu. Helstar are a band that I spoke about in the last The Year in Metal video. They released an album in 1988 as well. Once again, one of those prolific bands that just kept on putting things out. Next up, we've got Holy Moses, the New Machine of Liechtenstein. I hope I pronounced that right. I'm not really familiar with Holy Moses. I didn't get a chance to get around to these guys, but I have seen that name being mentioned quite a bit. Next up, one of my favorite bands of all time is Iced Earth. They released a demo called Enter the Realm. Now, this was actually re-released as a fully packaged album, and there's some fantastic material on it. Got to mention more hardcore bands, and there's no more hardcore than this band, and it is Judge. The album is called Bringing It Down. New York hardcore to the max. These guys influenced fucking everyone from Machine Head to Pantera to fucking Sepultura, fucking everyone. These guys were one of the hardest hardcore bands out there. Next up, we've got King Diamond with Conspiracy. Now, this is my favorite album by King Diamond. Now, this is actually a first press. As you can see, it's been well loved. On the back, we've got the band with King in his coffin. Absolute favorite King Diamond record. Next up, we've got Kiss with Hot in the Shade. Now, Kiss are a band, as I've described before, that are they're metal adjacent, or a band that really can push people into the style of metal, especially when it comes to their look and the way that they present themselves. Next up, we've got Creator, Extreme Aggression. I've spoken about Creator quite a bit on this channel and how much I like them. This is the remastered version from a couple of years ago, 2017. Sanctuary Records put out a bunch of stuff where it had like heaps of liner notes and the remastered album as well. And some of them had a bonus disc with like demos and live shit, and this is one of those. And I absolutely love this packaging. It's absolutely fucking amazing. Next up, we've got Lizzy Borden, Master of Disguise. Lizzy Borden are more of a hair metal kind of straightforward metal band, but I think that they're definitely worth a mention because they're a band that I think influenced a lot of other metal bands coming out through the 90s. Next up, we've got Macabre with Gloom. I think that this might have been their first record, but I would imagine that my memory is pretty shot when it comes to a lot of these kinds of pieces of information. Next up, we've got Metal Church with Blessing in Disguise. Now, Metal Church are a band that I literally have only just gotten into in the last kind of 12 months. They're a band that I was always like, Metal Church is a bit of a weird name for a metal band. Maybe they're a band that just sings about metal, which kind of puts me off every now and then where they're just talking about metal. Same kind of thing with Manowar kind of puts me off about those guys as well. But I slept on them for way too long, and I absolutely love them now. Next up is a band who was a progenitor for more of a sludge style, Melvins with the album Ozma. They were a grungy, sludgy band before grunge was even a thing. So I definitely think that they're worth a mention on this one. We've got Ministry, The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste. Ministry are one of the first metal bands that I ever heard. So they're definitely worth a mention in this list. Obviously, they're more of the industrial kind of metal and more towards the groove kind of stuff. So, and their vocalist Al is one of the most fucking psychotic people on the planet. Next up, we've got an amazing crossover band that doesn't really get mentioned a lot, and they're called MOD. The album is called Gross Misconduct. The album cover of this is one of my favorite things to look at. Crossover is a genre that I really think that I'm going to have to do more of a deep dive in. There are a lot of bands that I missed. MOD is definitely one of them, or they could be called Mod. I might get that wrong. Bands like DRI, Stormtroopers of Death, and Suicidal Tendencies are bands that I've definitely picked up on, but there's a lot that I've missed. Next up, one of my favorite albums of all time, Morbid Angels, Altars of Madness. This is a repress from a couple of years ago. I've got 3 copies of this album. I've got this one on vinyl, and then I've got 2 on CD. One is an original CD, and then the other one is the Earache repress from a couple of years ago. And this is actually on a really nice kind of wine color. Really beautiful. Okay, Morbid Angel, where are we up to? Okay, next up we've got Morgoth with Resurrection Absurd. Now, Morgoth are a death metal band that I don't think gets enough praise. I have never been able to see them live, but I did see Insidious Disease a couple of years ago. Well, fucking more than a couple of years ago. It was 11 years ago in Germany. And the vocalist from Morgoth is actually in Insidious Disease, and just hearing his vocals live was fucking amazing, so crushing. Next up, we've got an Australian essential, Mortal Sin with Face of Despair. Now, Mortal Sin are one of the bands in the history of metal, or Australian metal, I should say, that really put Australia on the map. They are talked about in circles of people who really know what they're talking about when it comes to thrash metal. I've been fortunate enough to see them a couple of times live, and they're fucking awesome. Unfortunately, they have broken up, but there has been some rumblings of them getting back together, so hopefully, fingers crossed, we can get them back together. Next up, we've got Motley Crue with Dr. Feelgood. As I said before, this one went to number one, and in all of America, really. I don't know if it came in number 1 in Australia, but on the Billboard charts, it was number 1. Next up, we've got Nasty Savage with Breaking Point. Nasty Savage I've spoken about before, where I thought that they were just like a hair metal band, but I was completely wrong. They're a fucking fantastic, thrashy fucking metal band. Next up, we've got 9 Inch Nails with Pretty Hate Machine. I think that Pretty Hate Machine is a fucking awesome record, and it really paved the way for a lot of bands to push their sound into more of an industrial metal style. I think that 9 Inch Nails really paved the way for bands like Fear Factory and even Pantera when it comes to like groovy kind of things. So yeah, a fucking fantastic record. Next up, we've got Nirvana with Bleach. You know, Nirvana bringing out an album in 1989, and it's heavy as fuck. That record is so heavy and so amazingly well put together. There was obvious signs that they were going to be a huge band. Maybe not signs as huge as they were, but definitely you could hear some flourishes of excellence. Next up, we've got Nuclear Assault with Handle with Care. I've spoken about Nuclear Assault a little bit on the channel before. They're a band that I feel like get looked over quite a bit. I feel a bit precious about certain bands. There are certain bands that I hear and I listen to and I'm like, why aren't people talking about this? It is what it is. If you like thrash, you're definitely going to like Nuclear Assault. Next up, we've got Obituary with Slowly We Rot. This one here. Now, I picked this one up not long ago. It is a repress on Roadrunner Records / Music on Vinyl. It is just a black pressing. Nothing too special about it, but I'll slide it out anyway because we all love to look at some nice crispy wax. Okay. Man, we're just hammering through this one, aren't we? Next up, we've got Onslaught with In Search of Sanity, an amazing thrash metal album. Everyone needs to take a shot. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you should go and watch the last video. Next up, we've got Overkill, The Years of Decay. Now, Overkill are a band that I have spoken about once again. They're definitely a band that gets overlooked, and I would probably put them up above Megadeth as well. But once again, this isn't a video of me hating on Megadeth. It's just that I think that Megadeth get put into brackets of bands that I don't necessarily think that they should sit in. Bands like Overkill get overlooked. I don't know why. They're a fantastic band. They've been putting out consistently amazing heavy records since the late 80s, since the mid 80s actually. 85 or something like that was one of their first albums. Next up, we've got Pestilence with Consuming Impulse. Now, this is original 1989 press of this album. This is my favorite album by Pestilence. It is one of the first death metal albums that I ever owned. I've owned this since maybe 99, maybe 98, 99, something like that, when I was first getting into metal. It was definitely a huge gateway for me when it comes to getting into more extreme styles of music. Next up, we've got Rage with Secrets in a Weird World. I've spoken about Rage before. I feel like their newer material is much more for me. Their older material isn't necessarily my kind of thing, but I know a lot of people love them, so definitely got to be included on there. Next up, we've got Repulsion with Horrified. Now, these guys were progenitors of the grindcore scene. I've talked about grindcore before and said, like, you know, there are certain bands that I do like. Repulsion is definitely one of those bands that I enjoy. Next up, we've got Running Wild with Death or Glory. As I said before, Running Wild are not necessarily a band that I would listen to, but I know a lot of people love them, so they've definitely got to be on the list. Next up, we've got Sabotage with Gutter Ballet. Now, this one is an original. It's got the promo copy on there as well from 1989. Sabotage are a fantastic, straightforward heavy metal band with flourishes of power metal kind of stuff. If you haven't listened to these guys, you definitely should give them a check out. I'd say just start with this record. It's a little bit more melodic than their other stuff, but it's still fantastic. Okay, what do we got up next? One of the best albums of all time. We've got Sepultura with Beneath the Remains. This copy is beat to shit, but this is an original press from 1989. We've got the boys on the back there. I have 4 copies of this album, I want to say, just on straightforward black. Put that in its sleeve because it is so beat to shit. Beneath the Remains is, you know, before Beneath the Remains came out, there was Schizophrenia, obviously. Schizophrenia was where they were really coming into their own sound, and they were really creating what would be their next couple of albums. I think that Beneath the Remains really was just them honing in on that sound and becoming much more muscular with it. It was the album that a lot of people heard of Sepultura first, and especially because I think it was Scott Burns did this album. Flew down to Brazil. Yeah, mixed by Scott Burns and Tom Morris and Max Cavalera. So this was the first kind of record that was really touched by someone who knew what they were doing behind the desks. So absolutely amazing album. Next up, we've got the self-titled album by Skid Row. I've spoken about Sebastian Bach at length. I absolutely love that dude. The first record is amazing. Obviously, after that, what precedes that is Slave to the Grind, which is my favorite record by them. Next up, we've got Sodom with Agent Orange. Now, I'm sure that I've got this on CD somewhere, but I could not find it for the fucking life of me while I was trying to go through everything. Sodom, another one of those Teutonic thrash bands from Germany. But I think that these guys were really a close progenitor for death metal, along with bands like Possessed. Next up, we've got Soundgarden with Louder Than Love. Another one of those earlier Soundgarden records that wasn't really necessarily what I was into, but there was some fantastic tracks on it. Next up, we've got Stratovarius with Fright Night. I think this was maybe their second record. They are a band that I enjoy when they come on at a party, but it's not something that I'm going to put on when I'm sitting at home. It's just, I think it's more of a melodic power metal kind of style, and that's not really what I like out of power metal. Next up, we've got Suicidal Tendencies with Controlled by Hatred / Feel Like Shit Deja Vu. Suicidal Tendencies are a band that they're integral to the crossover style, and I think that the fact that they got signed to a major label and a lot of people were listening to them while they were skating or fucking whatever, doing washing at home, it was absolutely amazing. The more and more people that heard Suicidal Tendencies, then they would go to bands like Slayer, and they would go to bands like Morbid Angel. I'm all about the progress of like hearing bands that are not necessarily the most metal band ever, but are a gateway into more metal bands. Speaking of more metal bands, Terrorizer released their first album, World Downfall. Terrorizer are a absolutely crushing grind death metal band, and I think that they really pushed the way of more extreme death metal, especially when it comes to brutal death metal and grindcore. Next up, we've got Testament with Practice What You Preach, one of my favorite bands of all time, and this is my favorite album by them. The opening track, Practice What You Preach, is one of the first songs that I ever heard from these guys, and I think this is just a repress from the Megaforce. I think it's just I don't think it's a first press or anything like that. It might be, but whatever. Next up, we've got Toxic with Think This. Toxic, I've spoken about a little bit on the last video. They're another one of those bands that were just putting out record after record after record. They're another band that don't really get talked about much. I think that they're definitely worthy of people checking out, especially if you're into really fast thrash and crossover. Next up, we've got Venom with Prime Evil. Venom are a band that I think put out most of their best material in the early 80s. The later 80s kind of stuff wasn't necessarily for me. They're by no means not bad records, but they're just stuff that I don't really listen to. Next up, we've got Voivod with Nothing Face. These guys are a technical, thrashy band, I guess, kind of progressive kind of stuff. This is an original press. It's got the Noise label on it, so it was Noise International, so I think it's a American press, that means. I'm probably wrong about that. It doesn't have the liner notes in it, though, which is a shame, because I know that the liner notes were pretty fucking amazing to look at. But, you know, it is what it is. Next up, we've got Wasp with the Headless Children. Now, Wasp, let's talk about Wasp for a second. Wasp are a band that I've never really gotten into, and I wasn't really kind of wanting to check them out or anything like that to put them on the list, but because a lot of people listen to them, I decided to chuck them on. And it's for no point, there's no reason or anything like that. I just kind of like, I always thought that the singer Blackie Lawless, I want to say, he seems like a bit of a wanker. So I haven't really given them a chance. So if you're a Wasp fan and you think that there's an album that I need to check out, can you drop me a comment down below? I'd really love to deep dive into these guys. Next up, we've got Warrant with Dirty, Rotten, Filthy, Stinking Rich. Now, obviously, Warrant are a hair metal band, but I think it's important to list this album because it's got a fantastic album cover, and it's one of those albums that you would, if you were a kid, if you were like 10 years old, you'd see that and be like, holy fuck, this is scary, let's check it out, and then maybe get into more amazing bands. Next up, we've got Whiplash with Insult to Injury. Whiplash are another one of those bands, much like Overkill and Nuclear Assault and Onslaught, that don't get mentioned enough when it comes to talking about old school thrash metal. So if you're into that kind of stuff, you definitely should check that out. Next up, we've got White Zombie with Make Them Die Slowly. This predates any of their major label stuff. They were still a local New York heavy metal band, incorporating industrial metal and things like that. Recently, they did a box set where they released all of their pre-1992 records, because I think that's when they signed to Geffen in 91, I think it was, and then they released their first major label in 1992. But yeah, they had a bunch of great albums before that. Next up, we've got Wolfsbane with Live Fast, Die Fast. I mentioned before that Blaze Bayley was going to be mentioned, and so Blaze Bayley actually sang for Iron Maiden in between 1994 and 1999. Not one of my favorite vocalists when it comes to Iron Maiden, but the Wolfsbane records are absolutely fucking awesome. And last but not least, we've got Zentrix with Shattered Existence. Zentrix are another one of those bands, much like Overkill, much like Toxic, that just don't get mentioned often. And it's surprising because they have been putting out really, really good thrash metal since the mid-80s, or late 80s, I should say. So, that's it, 1989. It's all over. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments. I'm really enjoying putting these things together. I really appreciate everyone that is dropping me comments. The fact that you are spending your time with me during this lockdown. I mean, you've got thousands of shows to watch on Netflix and Hulu and Stan, wherever you are in the world. You can watch basically whatever you want. And the fact that you're spending your time with me means the world to me. So I definitely appreciate it. Once again, I am trying to get to 10,000 subscribers, so if you could do that, smash that subscribe button, that would be wonderful. It happens one person at a time, so I'd love that to happen. If you're wanting to follow me on social media, I am on Facebook, I am on Twitter, and I am on Instagram. It's where I'm going to be posting a lot of my collection updates and these videos, so make sure that you jump over there and we can have a chat. If you've got any recommendations for me to react to, let me know down in the comments. And if there's any kind of subject that you want me to deep dive into, let me know. You know, I'm happy to talk about basically anything when it comes to heavy metal. And one more thing, I'd really, really, really hope that you guys are staying safe and that everyone's happy and surrounded by loved ones. And yeah, I'm really happy talking to you guys about heavy metal. If there's anything about these lists that you want me to change, if you maybe want me to deep dive a little bit further or make these videos longer, I'd really love to hear from you. I want as much feedback as possible, as long as it's constructive. I don't want you to just jump on here and say that you suck. I want to know why I suck. That would be much appreciated. All right, then. I've been Luke, the Metal Hunter. I love you all. We'll see you next time. Bye.